Hey everybody, Pastor Greg here. I'm excited about life, and I know that you are too, because life is good and it's getting better all the time. It is so good to be here with you yet again. We've had a powerful series this month, Reimagine the Bible, and we're going to get into the final message in just a few moments. But I want to extend a special invitation to each and every one of you. If you're in the tri-state area, on July 24th, we're going to be celebrating Family and Friends Day, Summer Loving. We're going to have an awesome time, lots of food, and wonderful celebration. If you're in the area, this is my personal invitation to you to come and join us on that Sunday. As I've said, we have another powerful message to close our series, Reimagine the Bible. Let's get into today's message. Oh, it is. Well, good morning, Celebration Spiritual Center. How are we feeling this morning? Happy Pride. It's a wonderful day to celebrate. We are grateful and thankful to be in a place and a space that loves and affirms us all, that calls us holy, where there is no shame or blame or judgment. God isn't judging us. Why should we? Yes, yes. So we've had a powerful month with this series, and it's always interesting to me how, although we plan these series well in advance, a year in advance, how they just speak right to the moment. And I think about all the things that are taking place in our country, and I recognize that so much of the division and separation, whether we look at the upcoming election, whether we look at what took place in Orlando, whether we look at what took place in Great Britain just a few days ago, we're seeing how a literal reading of the Bible has permeated our culture in so many ways and creates so much separation and division. And I think it's incredibly important that as we look at this text, we have to reimagine it. We have to look at it differently and recognize that some things need to just be put down and we don't even need to read them or touch them anymore. And other things need to be understood where they were misunderstood or misinterpreted. So we started in week 1 with what's in your Bible. Powerful message as we looked at and sort of dealt with some basics around how the Bible was created and what it really reflects as it reflects its region. And then I asked another question as we recognize that the Bible really represents a lot of different voices and perspectives that don't always agree. It reflects ourselves in the sense that our lives many times reflect many different thoughts and beliefs and habits and patterns that don't always agree. And just as there are parts of the Bible that we need to put down, there are thoughts, habits, and patterns of thinking that we need to put down. Yes, yes? In week 2, You're Turning Me On, we looked at the Song of Songs and talked about desire. Recognizing that desire is a beautiful, important, natural, wonderful thing that is celebrated in Scripture. And we also looked at the idea that there's that beautiful passage that is attributed, interpreted metaphorically as God speaking to us that says, "You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you." God is not judging you. It says there's no flaw in you. And then last week, collateral imagination. We looked at the fact that there's an incredible amount of violence in the Bible. And one of the things about violence, there's collateral damage. There are unintended consequences. Innocent people are killed, and we see that in the Bible. Although it's written as though God wanted women and children to be killed, we recognize that that's actually an unintended consequence, and that's the problem with violence. But what I also talked about is the idea that just as there is an unintended consequence of additional violence or death, there's also what I call collateral imagination. That when an unwanted thing happens, when violence happens, when people are killed senselessly, it sparks our imagination. The killers, the terrorists, whoever you want to name, those people did not intend for us to now imagine a new world. And so as we are subject and see violence happening in our world and in our country, it actually gives birth to our desire for peace. It gives birth to our collateral imagination. Feel free to go back to YouTube and check out any of those messages, but we're moving on. And so as I was preparing for this message, I went back to a recording from Abraham. We went to see Abraham in Stanford in May, right? Yeah. And I went back to the recording from that event. It was wonderful. And there's something that Abraham says that points directly to where we want to go today. And Abraham said, "You must no longer condemn the starting place." And what that means simply is we recognize the principle that we have an experience that may be unwanted. right? And what we can do is when we have that unwanted experience, many times we complain, we moan, we pout, we kick and scream, right? And then that keeps us in the vibration of that unwanted thing. But the principle is that when an unwanted thing, that starting place shows up, it gives birth, as we talked about last week, to a new desire. And so when a frustrating moment shows up, you can, by recognizing the principle, can say, oh, this unwanted thing is here, this sickness is here, this layoff is here, this low bank account balance is here, but I recognize that this is the thing that is giving birth to the opposite experience. And so we have the opportunity to move there. And so I thought it was wonderful that Source brought me back to that idea of not condemning the starting place, because I want to talk about the way stories start in the Bible, in the First Testament or the Old Testament. Because I think it's always interesting how many of those stories start. Now, we did a series on spiritual economics, Eric Butterworth, and there's something that he says that I like. He said, if you look at a lot of the Bible stories, you'll see where the writers will say, and it came to pass, ... And that's powerful, because what he was offering us to understand is that the unwanted thing shows up to pass. Not to stay there. And it came to pass that this thing showed up. But that was the beginning of the story, and we recognized that the story was always bringing us to a miracle or some wonderful, powerful experience. And it came to pass. Another intro that I love, the book of Exodus, starts very interesting. Because before Exodus, we have the story of Joseph, and that's an amazing story and a miraculous story. And then we move to Exodus into a new story, and it starts this way. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And what that meant then is that that's what led to the enslavement of Joseph's people, because he was fearful that they outnumber us. And so we as the Egyptians, we need to make sure we have them under control. Now that's an unwanted thing, right? That's a starting place, but we recognize that that starting place is what then gives birth to Moses. It's what then gives birth to the Exodus. It's then what gives birth to freedom. It's then what gives birth to the miracles, right? Starting place. And so as I thought about that, I knew when we were planning this series, I told Pastor Yolanda, I said, I gotta preach on the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, it's a very short book, only 4 chapters, and it's a part of the writings. As we have, some of the instructions and laws and codes in Leviticus, and we have the origin stories with the story of Moses and all of the stories of David. We have the writings, that Job would be a part of the writings, and it's a story, right? And this story, I think, is incredibly important because it can show us a few things about how we can deal with our starting places. Abraham is inviting us not to condemn the starting place, but I want to give you a little background on this book, because as the Bible is the Bible, it's highly problematic, right? And so the thing about the book of Ruth, where it's highly problematic, and we need to, last week I talked about our hermeneutic of suspicion, to put a certain lens and sort of side-eye the text in order to critique it, right? Here we're going to put on our womanist or feminist hermeneutic, because we need to look at this text from that perspective and sort of call some things out before we can actually find what is powerful and beneficial in the story. Because the way the book of Ruth is generally taught, the way the book of Ruth is generally preached to women is to wait to find your Boaz. And if you read the story, what the story is telling us is that a woman is not legitimized until a man recognizes her or marries her. That's a problem, y'all. Right? We were watching yesterday the documentary on Shirley Chisholm, Unbought and Unbossed. And one of the representatives from the National Organization of Women at that time, she talked about how recognizing that there were so many problems at that time in our country that a woman, for instance, could not get a credit card unless she was married. It had to be in her husband's name. Right? Again, this idea of legitimacy, right? That there wasn't even financial legitimacy except you were connected to a male, right? Reflected the same thing in this text. Now we know that's not cool. Yes, yes? But again, a literal interpretation of this story has continued to create these sort of problems, and we're grateful for the level of equality that we experience now, but we know we're not completely there yet. Yes, yes? The other thing I think that's interesting when we consider where we are in this time and place in our country and what's really being discussed around the world is we can look at the book of Ruth to talk about how immigrants should be treated. Ruth was an immigrant. She was from a land called Moab and comes to a land of Bethlehem in Judah, right? She was a foreigner. She was an immigrant. There's a large conversation in our electoral politics today about how immigrants should or should not be treated. And not just in this country, but also in Great Britain. That's one of the things that was used to create the separation that led to Brexit, right? Syrian refugees, right? And so we can look at this story and we find a very interesting and I think beautiful way to treat immigrants, regardless of where they are or where they're from. And so as I was preparing for this text, I was reminded of my time in seminary. I had to take a class just on this book, a full semester. It was awesome. And one of the things that my professor kept pushing us to look at, he says, look at the economics in the story. Because there's actually a beautiful and powerful conversation that's happening. And so as we talk about the starting place, let's look at where Ruth starts. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. There's the starting place. You hear it? What was happening? There was a famine. There was an unwanted thing. And because there was a famine, this man from Bethlehem, loving his family and wanting the best for them, said, we got to go somewhere else. We got to move. We got to go where we hear that there is sustenance, where there is bread, where there is food, where there are jobs. Similar to the Syrian refugees. Similar to our Mexican brothers and sisters that are moving away from a place to have a different economic future. Maybe if not for themselves, definitely for their children. A starting place. And the names of this family, the man is Elimelech. The woman, her name is Naomi, his wife. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And there they are in this foreign land in Moab. Mahlon and Chilion, they grow up and they get married. And their wives' names are Orpah and Ruth. Now, the next part of the story moves forward. Elimelech, he transitions. He dies. And so now Naomi is a widow with her 2 sons and her daughters. But then the sons die. And now you have 3 women by themselves. Now again, the reading of the text, a certain reading of the text, a certain interpretation of the text is now they're nobodies in the eyes of society because they have no man to speak for them. And so Naomi, naturally, her husband has died, her 2 sons have died. She's a little distraught. And she's in this land of Moab, which is not her home. And she says, well, the best thing I can do, I need to go back to my home. I need to go back to Bethlehem in Judah. When we look at what these names mean, Bethlehem means house of bread. I need to go back to the house of bread. And she tells her daughters, her daughter-in-laws, she tells them, you know what, you all should just go back to your homes because I don't have anything for you. I'm a woman. Based on this society, I don't have any money, I don't have any property, I don't have anything that I can give you. Even if I go back to my home and find someone else and marry him and have children, again, are y'all gonna wait for them to become of age to marry them? The best thing you can do is just go. And both Orpah and Ruth, they plead with her and they say, no, we're gonna stay with you. We wanna be by your side. And Naomi pushes again, and Naomi was just in a bad way, right? She was doing this thing that we're talking about. She was condemning her starting place, right? Because all of these things had happened, and she's like, all is lost. The best thing y'all can do is get away from me, right? Get away from this curse. And finally, after pushing and pushing, Orpah was like, okay, I'm out. God bless you. I love you. Thank you. Bye. Orpah leaves. But Ruth, She doesn't leave. Ruth is interesting to me because as we talk about this idea of the starting place, Ruth, I think, understood this principle. She understood that I don't need to condemn this place, that she understood somewhere within herself that there was still a possibility and there was still something that could change, a different experience. And so she speaks to Naomi and she says, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." Very interesting. And let's just unpack again, who is Ruth? Ruth is a woman from Moab. Elimelech and Naomi moved to this other country, Moab, and of course, their sons met two women in the country and got married. Ruth is from Moab, but she says, "No, you, my mother-in-law, I'm going to stick by you." Ruth's name means friend. I'm going to stick by you. I'm going to stick with you no matter what. Even to the point of saying that although because we're from different lands and different countries, we have different religions, your God will be my God. And so, of course, Naomi has to concede, right? And they go on this journey back to the house of bread, back to Bethlehem in Judah. And when they get there, people who remember Naomi from back in the day are happy to see her. Naomi's still in her story. She's still in her story. "Oh, all is lost. My life is terrible." She even goes on to say, "Don't even call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. Naomi means delight. She said, "My name is not delight anymore. I'm not happy. Call me bitter." Because my sons are dead, my husband is dead, and I'm here, me and my daughter-in-law, with nothing. I love the symbolism of the meanings of the names. This is why we know these storytellers. We got to understand that by the time that these stories were written, they had been told over and over and over again for hundreds of years. And so they had been massaged and shaped by different storytellers. And so we have a version of the story here, but it's beautiful, right? This idea that Naomi, whose name means delight, is now saying, "Call me bitter." But we've all done that in our lives, right? Right? We're in our starting place. Things seem to not be going well. And we could have a perspective like Ruth has, that's standing there right in front of our face. She could be inspired by Ruth and say, well, if Ruth has faith, if Ruth is able to stand in this place in spite of, she's getting ready to go to a place that she's never been before, where she is the outsider, where she is the immigrant. If she can hold the space, maybe I can. But Naomi was in her story, just telling the story. I don't have a man. My husband is gone. I don't have my sons who would be the other men to quote unquote legitimize me. But again, we got to critique that, right? I mean, it's interesting. We could even imagine if Naomi was able to adopt a womanist perspective. There's a lot of things she could have done. She could have set up shop. She could have set up a business, and she could have built a life for herself and for her daughters, right? That could have happened. But because she thought that something outside of her legitimized her, she was bitter. Interesting. And that's not just a womanist or feminist perspective. That applies to all of us. If you think that something outside of you legitimizes you, this is why we celebrate Pride, why I love Pride, right? The point is we affirm ourselves, right? That was the point. Because for the longest time, the LGBT community was looking for others to affirm them, looking for others to say, oh, you matter. But Pride turns the whole thing on its head and says, I celebrate me, who and what I am. I am a natural child of God. I love myself. I'm not waiting for you to love me. Yes. Right? But Naomi couldn't see that. And when you don't see that, your name becomes bitter. Yes. And so they moved to the house of bread. They're in Jerusalem. And Ruth gets an idea. You can't get ideas unless you're in this place that Ruth is in. Naomi didn't have any ideas. She didn't have any ideas. But Ruth got up one morning, she said, you know what? I'm going to go out to the field and glean or pick the harvest, the wheat harvest. I'm going to go out in the field and see if I can, get some wheat for us so we can make bread and have something to eat, and then hopefully sell some, right? And we'll have money. And what's interesting, Ruth was enterprising and respectful, because she recognized that as she was from Moab and as she was a immigrant, right, she recognized that she didn't have the same rights and privileges, and so she couldn't just go to anybody's land and just farm. So what she decided to do was to just follow behind the other gleaners, because she figured, you know what, they're going to, miss some things, and there might be, just some things I can grab, right? Again, keeping this positive attitude that we're going to be okay. Right, keeping this positive attitude, and it reminds me so much when we think about the spirit of the immigrants in this country, which technically we all are, right? You recognize that spirit of just being willing, okay, no, this may not be the most ideal thing for me, but for many of our immigrants, they understood that I will wash those floors, or I will clean that bathroom so that my children can go to college and have a better experience. Yes, yes. And so Ruth was showing us that same enterprising spirit, and was willing to do that, being respectful, not being too proud, because she loved her mother-in-law and she wanted to provide for them. And so she spent the day gleaning, and they were taking a break, and it just so happened, and this is again how I love how Source works, it just so happens that the field that she picked belonged to a man named Boaz. And Boaz, as it said in the text, was a relative or a kinsman of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now that's very interesting. I love how when we're in this space, we're guided. Sometimes we don't even know what we're really being guided to, but it's like, just go over there. Inspired idea, inspired action. And it turned out the field that she went to was the best field she could have ever gone to, because it was owned by Elimelech's kinsman, and we'll talk about what that actually means. But as they were taking a break, Boaz, he shows up on the scene, and he sees a woman who he's never seen before. He knows she's not from around there, and he asks, who is this woman? And they're like, oh, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth. And he was like, oh, Ruth, yeah, I heard about her. I heard about how, she chose to come with Naomi, and she stuck by her side, and I think that's just a beautiful thing. I tell y'all what, let her pick and glean from the field as much as she wants. Don't bother her. Give her her own space. Let her work just as you work, right? Let her pick just as you pick. Interesting. As she was willing to humble herself and recognizing that she could just pull from maybe the scraps, right? She recognized that she could get something. Out of doing that, she was recognized and being elevated to an equal status, although she was an immigrant. And this is why I say that we can look to this story, and some of our elected officials or wannabe elected officials can look to this story and say, what does the Bible, what does Christianity, what does this text have to say about how we should treat our immigrants? This is what Boaz did. He celebrated her. He affirmed her. He didn't treat her as a foreigner. He didn't treat her as less than. He didn't call her names. He didn't judge her. If we want to use the text for something positive, if we want to use this text, otherwise we just got to eliminate it. But since so many people in this country are still reading the Bible and interpreting life based on this, then let's use this text affirmatively. This is how we treat our brothers and sisters. In truth, we're one family on one planet, right? So there really is no immigrant or foreigner. All of that stuff is just separation. But as we recognize that there are those that are coming from other countries, just as, again, on all of us, our ancestors on some level, wanted or unwanted, arrived here from other countries. We have a way that we can treat the immigrants. And so Ruth has this awesome experience. She has more than enough wheat. She's able to sell some. She's able to keep some. And she comes home to Naomi and shows her what has happened. And now Naomi was excited. She was like, wow, this is amazing, and you found favor, and you didn't know this, but actually Boaz, that's the perfect field you could have ever gone to, because he is my husband's kinsman. Now, why was that important, or why was that even significant? Well, within the law and the practice at that time, it was written that if a woman became a widow, the brother-in-law or the nearest kinsman, it was actually his duty to marry that woman, right? And so while we can critique this idea of being legitimized by a man, there was a somewhat loving aspect to this that, and we hear it in the voice of God, to remember the widows and orphans. And so there was always this idea that do not leave anyone stranded out there by themselves, right? That was really the heart of it, right? Although it was definitely very patriarchal, and we're grateful that we don't live under those rules today. There was a sense of love and making sure that everybody was taken care of. And so that's why it was exciting to Naomi, recognizing that there may be a possibility for Boaz to marry Ruth. One of the things, and this is a story within the First Testament that's completely misinterpreted, but it's based on this practice. You may know the story of Onan. And unfortunately, for many interpretations have used the story of Onan to say that masturbation is bad, right? Because what happened with the story of Onan, his brother died, and so based on the practice, he was supposed to marry and give children to his sister-in-law. He chose not to, right? He actually slept with her, but she didn't conceive. And so a misinterpretation of that text has led to all kinds of judgment and shame and blame around sex and sexuality. But what was rooted in that story was this practice. And so the reason, as it's written, the reason that God was mad, and God doesn't get mad at us, it's a story, was because he didn't follow this so-called practice. And so here we see it show up yet again in the book of Ruth. And so as Naomi was very excited now, recognizing that, you found Boaz's field, and you found favor in the eyes of Boaz, which is what happens. We got to come back to the principle. This is what happens when we operate as Ruth operated with our starting place, not condemning it, not knowing what was going to happen. There's no way that Ruth knew what was going to happen, right? She wasn't a Jew, right? She wasn't practicing Jewish customs or laws. So there was no way that she could have thought ahead and said, maybe if I pick the right field and I'll find somebody who's a kinsman of my father-in-law. She wasn't thinking about any of that. But she was following her heart, and she was following her faith, and she was following this idea, this feeling within her that things will work out, that all will be well. And so then Naomi gives her instructions. And I love this because I'm sure these instructions didn't make sense to Ruth. But Naomi said, "Do as I say, and I promise you all will be well." She says, "Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism here. But what we recognize, what Naomi was offering to Ruth, she was giving her the instructions on the practice to let this man know that she was available and interested, essentially, right? Now, again, what's interesting to me about this, and as we apply it to our own lives, sometimes we get an inspired idea that does not make sense in the moment. You have to remember, this was completely foreign to Ruth. Ruth didn't know anything about these practices and lying on the threshing floor and wait till after he's eaten first before you do it and uncover his feet and, wait for him to tell you what to do. She didn't know anything about this. But when we live in this inspired place, this is what happens. Source will give you just an idea. It will give you an urge. It will give you a hunch, right? It'll tell you to go this way or don't go this way or stay where you are or call this person that you haven't talked to in 13 years. But when you're in this place that Ruth is in, this is what happens. And so, of course, as the story goes along, Boaz, he was asleep. He wakes up. He sees Ruth. He's like, "Who is this woman?" And Ruth says, "It is I, it is Ruth." And then he realizes what's going on and he says, "Okay, I know the practice. Of course, there's actually someone else who's a closer relative than I am. And so based on the practice, he would actually have to be the one to marry you. So I need to have a conversation with him, right? If he is unable, I am 100% absolutely able and available, right? And so he does his due diligence, and long story short, Boaz and Ruth, they do get married. And part of why this story was written down and included is because it's believed from the origin that Boaz and Ruth, out of their line and out of the love and the beauty of the story, this is the line that David comes out of. And out of the line of David, it is then said, based on the origin, that then this is the line that Jesus comes out of. And so Jews and Christians alike love this story because they believe that it points to God honoring this marriage between an immigrant, a foreigner, and Boaz, who was loving, and it gave birth to King David and Solomon and on, and ultimately Jesus. Again, origin. So Abraham reminds us not to condemn our starting place. The story of Ruth reminds us not to condemn our starting place. The story of Ruth starts with a famine. Starts with a famine in the land. And Elimelech, being a loving husband and father, did what most husbands and fathers would do. I'm reminded when I was a child, we moved to Jacksonville, Florida, but my father moved ahead a year before to establish everything, to make sure we had everything we needed. And then he came back in the summer and got us and drove us down in the truck, right? Still remember that, right? This is what fathers do. And he was willing to go to a land that he didn't know. He was willing to go to a foreign land. Again, just as so many of our immigrant parents, our immigrant brothers and sisters did the same thing. Or even if we want to talk about in this country, right? We recognize for me as my family comes from the South, right? All my grandparents, they moved up north. That migration was important. It was the same thing. And God knows moving from the South up to the cities of the North was just like moving to another country in many cases. With my grandmother, because there were so many siblings, her brothers and sisters moved up first. When they got settled, then my grandmother moved up to Jersey and worked in a sewing factory, right? And so from that, there was opportunity, but then there was a new starting place because Elimelech transitions and the sons transition. And we could choose to be like Naomi was. And God knows we've all been in that place, right? Of keeping that story going and being bitter. Being bitter so much so that we just say, call me bitter. Just call me complainer. Right? Her name means delight. Your name means delight. You were created to just be in joy all the time, right? But here we have Ruth, whose name means friend. She said, where you go, I will go, and your God will be my God. And Ruth found favor, not because Ruth was special, but because of how she was able to hold that situation. I mean, nobody, as much as Naomi was complaining, Ruth also lost her husband. Right? Ruth was also a widow. Ruth also had technically every reason to be just like Naomi. But she was willing to do something different. She was willing to go somewhere where she had never been. To go to Bethlehem and believing that she would find favor, and she did. She was willing to do something, and again, this is that thing that so many of us don't want to do. I'm grateful for all of my internships where I fetched coffee and just did filing and things that had nothing to do with what I thought I was going to be doing. But all of those things prepared me, and I found favor. As I showed that I was meticulous and disciplined, as I showed that I could take this menial task but bring excellence to it. And that's how we're given other opportunities. Yes, yes. But the only way that we can get to that place, we can't judge the task. We can't judge that place that we're in. Ruth didn't do that. And she found amazing favor. Again, it's a story. Please don't take this to say that women need a man to legitimize them. It's not about that. But there is a symbolic Boaz in our lives, right? There's a symbolic Boaz experience that each of us are seeking as we're in this starting place of something that's unwanted. But like Ruth, we can have that unwanted thing and it translate into much joy and much prosperity. On that, let us stand. Let us stand. Oh my goodness. This principle is reflected in the Taoist story. And I love these ancient Chinese stories because of their titles. The story is just titled, Sai Ang Falls Off a Horse. And there was this young man by the name of Sai Ang. He was riding his horse, he falls and he breaks his leg. And everybody comes to Sai Ang's house and they were, oh, we're so sorry. Oh no, you broke your leg. Oh, this is so terrible, right? And there was an old man, a grandfather that was sitting there like old men do in stories. Just observing. And he says, what if this is some sort of blessing? People looked at him like he was crazy. What do you mean, old man? He broke his leg. How can that be a blessing? Well, it came to pass that a war happened with the neighboring village. And all of the men of the village had to go to war to defend, but Sai Ang couldn't fight in the war because his leg was broken. All of those men were killed. Sai Ang lived. What if this is some sort of blessing? Don't judge the starting place. Because you don't know, you don't have the vantage point. Pastor Yolanda and I were talking about it. Think about your GPS. Sometimes I fuss at the GPS when it's trying to tell me to go somewhere. I'm like, why is it telling me to go there? That's not the right way, but I don't have the same vantage point as the GPS. The GPS is connected to satellites that can see and read and interpret data all over the planet, but I think I know something based on my vantage point. Right? Depending on which app you use, it's getting crowdsourced data about traffic in real time that's happening, and I'm fussing at this thing that has a perspective that I don't have. We do the same thing in our own lives. Source is that GPS. Source is that perspective. It lives within you. It is always guiding you. It is always nudging you. It is always telling you which way to go. Don't judge it. But recognize that even the unwanted experience, what if it's some sort of blessing? So, Mother, Father, God, we are grateful and thankful. We are grateful and thankful for this series as we have endeavored to reimagine this text called the Bible. We are grateful and thankful that we are in a place and space where we can look at this differently, put down those things which no longer have any value or meaning, but find that which is affirmative, find that which is loving, find that which is unconditional, find that which is eternal, find that which is inspirational, and we focus on it. We are grateful and thankful that we are no longer in bondage to the unwanted things that are in that text. We stand here now in love with the starting place. We stand here now recognizing that we may have an unwanted thing in our lives. It may be dis-ease or discomfort in our bodies. It may be the need for a new job. It may be a layoff. It may be a low bank account. It may be not enough money. It may be I don't know my purpose. It may be I'm looking for a relationship. It may be I just had a breakup. It may be contention in my family. It may be stuff going on with my kids. It may be I don't like where I live. It may be I need to live. It may be an eviction, whatever it may be, we now recognize that the starting place does not matter. Because we know that you, Source, will use this moment that we are in, any moment, anything, and you can bring us to our greatest glory. We hear the words from the text, and it came to pass. And so as we are in this unwanted space, whatever it is for you here and now in this moment, know that it has come to pass. You are moving through it. You are not staying in it. It showed up so it could leave. And so we are grateful and thankful for the path of our lives. And we are grateful and thankful for you, our internal GPS, always guiding us, always loving us, unconditional. We are grateful that there is no judgment in the mind of God. You do not condemn. But you are an unconditionally loving presence, infinite intelligence, infinite mind, divine love. And so we choose to walk through this week differently. We choose to walk through this week with a new perspective. We choose to walk through this week as the unwanted things show up and know that it is giving birth to the wanted thing, and we rest. We follow in the footsteps of Ruth, and we say, where you go, I will go, and your God will be my God, and we know that we will find favor. And so it is with gratitude and thanksgiving I release this prayer, and together we say, amen, amen. Ashe. And so it is. So it is. Thank you, God.